Today, I will be talking about how the different social levels viewed the French Revolution. After the American Revolution, France supplied the patriots with weapons and funds. In 1789, after the patriots succeeded in their fight for independence, King Louis XVI was sapped of funds, so he imposed a new tax law on the French people. However, this action angered the peasants, also known as the Third Estate, causing them to form the National Assembly, to gain control over their rights to say what happened with their money and their country. The estates are how the French classified themselves. The First Estate was comprised of the top 0.5% of the country, and was made of royalty and the elite who owned any part of the church. These people were very rich and showed disdain towards the Second and Third Estates, who had fewer rights than they did. The most notorious members of the First Estate were the King and Queen. King Louis XVI is often described as being weak in character and a feeble ruler. His queen, Marie Antoinette, was known for spending lavishly. The Second Estate was made of the noblemen and noblewomen with different levels of nobility. Second Estatesmen had titles such as Duc, Vicomte, Baron, Chevalier, or Comte. These were titles earned for being in the military or having a judicial role, such as Noblesse d'épée, which means nobility of the sword, or Noblesse des robes, which means nobility of the robe. While many of the Second Estate were wealthy, there were less wealthy Second Estatesmen, often living on smaller, rural properties. The Second Estatesmen were exempt from personal taxes. The higher class Second Estatesmen were seen as lazy and immoral, which most of them were. The Third Estate, representing the other 98% of the population, was made of commoners, and like the Second and First Estate, it had different levels and variations of wealth. It ranged from beggars and hobos to merchants and shopkeepers. Although the Third Estate accounted for almost all of the population and 100% of France's tax income, they were treated very poorly. Their political views were not respected, which led to major conflicts between estates. They were sick of having their political views ignored. They did not get a fair say in what happened to their country, yet were the ones who paid all the taxes. The Third Estate, under constant political and economic depression, grew tired and frustrated by the lack of compromise to help them improve their situation. The bourgeoisie, the wealthiest of this class, who were managing a successful economy, but not yet classified as Second Estate, became increasingly frustrated. These businessmen were reading about enlightenment, promoting limited nobility, freedom of speech, and equality. They began to align with the thought that government should be representative, accountable, and based on popular sovereignty. While enlightenment was gaining a foothold in the Third Estate, it might seem that the Second Estate noblemen would be against these ideas and would want to protest their lifestyle. On the contrary, many of them became prominent supporters of the revolution for a number of different reasons. Like the bourgeois of the Third Estate, some of the noblemen of the Second Estate were inspired through books and studies of enlightenment. Some members of the Second Estate had experience with the success of the American Revolution, while others supported the concept of a modern economy. In June of 1789, the National Assembly was formed by members of both the Second and Third Estates. The National Assembly declared that they would do anything in their power to bring the Third Estate some respect, and that they would only disband when a new constitution was created. The National Assembly wrote the Cahiers de Doléances, also known as the Book of Grievances. The Book of Grievances was just that, everything the Third Estate did not like about the government. Unfortunately, the creation of the Book of Grievances brought about no change, leaving the Third Estate searching for a new tactic. The National Assembly then spent 6 months working on a new constitution, and in 1790, the Civil Constitution of the Clergy was published as a formal declaration that the Third Estatesmen were demanding their rights back. The Constitution of the Clergy was aimed at not the government, but the church reformation by asking the church to compromise with the French government. They asked the church to take a subordinate role to the government and let the people elect their bishops and priests, rather than them ruled and controlled from within the church. The First Estate did not like the idea of the church not having a say in government, but they made a compromise and the Constitution of the Clergy was passed, though not easily. Thus, in 1790, the National Assembly's second try to plead for their rights succeeded. Finally, things were looking up for the Third Statesmen. King Louis XVI was once again respected as king by his subjects due to his willingness to compromise with the constitution of the clergy. For nearly a year and a half, there was peace in France. Then, in April of 1791, conflicts began to surface again. Comte de Mirabeau, one of the most respected members of the National Assembly, as well as a respected representative of the Third Estate, died of natural causes. His death made the Third Estate feel like they lost true representation in the new system. The death of Mirabeau was stressful for the king, so his advisors suggested he leave the country for a short while. The royal family were heading to their vacation home in St. Cloud when a mob in Paris blocked their way. With the royal family stuck in Paris, the growing anger of the Third Statesmen erupted all around them in riots outside the king's palace in Versailles. The royal family tried to flee to Austria, but were caught and held captive in Varennes. Initially, the king was stripped of his privileges. The National Assembly was finally getting a shot at taking a republic control. But with much to debate, 3 days later, the National Assembly declared that the king had been abducted, restored his privileges, and returned him to Paris under close guard. This was seen as a compromise. While the National Assembly lost their chance of building their new social system, they felt the level of conflict across Paris would keep them from being successful.
Put it briefly, the next 5 years were a whirlwind of different conflicts. The decision to put the king back in charge angered two groups of radical revolutionists, called the Jacobin Club and the Cordeliers Club. The two clubs planned to riot on Champ de Mars, a military parade ground in Paris. On July 16, 1791, the Champ de Mars massacre unfolded. The groups were writing a petition that called for the king to be sent to a trial, and that France convert from monarchy into a republic. The National Assembly, fearing violence, banned the meeting and sent the National Guard to the groups. Despite the groups' attempt to get their way in a calmer fashion, chaos ensued. The end result was the National Guard firing into the crowd and killing somewhere between 20 and 50 people. Afterwards, the National Assembly tried to push the blame onto two political clubs, ordered for the suppression of radical newspapers, and banned any meetings of the Cordeliers Club and Jacobin Club. A month later, the government decided to create a new committee called the Legislative Assembly. The National Assembly immediately started to plan the first draft of the new constitution. After the banning of religious dress in public, the people of the Third Estate started to become noticeably angrier, realizing that action must be taken to stop the government from taking away other rights. In October of 1791, the day before the Legislative Assembly met for the first time, the National Assembly met and agreed to dissolve their assembly. A month later, the king vetoed the Legislative Assembly's November 9th decree, which stated that immigrants from France return immediately on penalty of death. 20 days later, the Legislative Assembly ordered the arrest of all non-juring priests, which the king vetoed again. On January 1st, 1792, a mob of rioters stormed the royal palace and overthrew the Legislative Assembly. The presumed traitors who overthrew the Legislative Assembly were purged by Minister of Justice George Danton. On January 21st, 1793, the Legislative Assembly condemned and executed the king and queen by guillotine. In February of the same year, the government foolishly declared war on the first coalition of Austria, Prussia, Britain, Holland, and Spain for no known reason. They did this without having an actual military, so in August a military draft was instituted. In early April of 1794, Danton was executed by the Legislative Assembly. Over a year later, a new constitution was put into place, forming the Directory, a council for France's government, which the Third Estate did not like. Multiple battles occurred in that year, all aiming to topple the Directory. The coup d'etat, a rebel group, removed the supporters of the king and queen from the Directory. Ultimately, General Napoleon's whiff of grape shot battles saved the Directory in 1797, thus ending the French Revolution.
The themes of conflict and compromise are found throughout the French Revolution, with the French citizens' desire to change their tax laws, which began a conflict that would last 10 years to change those rules. There were many compromises attempted to avoid conflict, such as the king passing the constitution of the clergy or the Legislative Assembly giving rights to black men born to free parents. Ultimately, it was only through conflict that true changes were able to occur.